On the foggy night of July 25th, 1956, two ships found each other off the coast of Nantucket, and in the 11 hours that followed, three different stories about how the genuine article dies were set in motion at once. The first was a work of art, and she died fast. That same night, brought down not by the blows she took, but by the corners that had been cut around her. The second was a one-of-one masterpiece riding unseen in a cargo hold, and she went to the bottom with the first. Never once having been shown to the world, she'd been built to astonish. The third was the ship that struck the other two down, and she did not die at all. Not for another 67 years, because she was a fighter built to take a hit and keep going. And when she finally did die, it was not the sea that killed her, it was a court order. A bill for dock rent she could not pay. As the thesis this whole grim night teaches, if you are willing to look at it squarely, the sea is not the enemy of the genuine article. The sea is honest, it is enormous and indifferent, and it takes what physics says it may take and no more. What actually kills the best things, the work of art, the masterpiece, the indestructible survivor, is something smaller and meaner and entirely human. It is the cut corner, the unballasted tank, the unpaid invoice, the ledger, over it and over. In this story, and far beyond it, the ocean spares what the paperwork condemns. So let me tell all three in order, because together they make a single argument about where the danger really comes from. Not the deep, the desk. The SS Andrea Doria was, by common consent, the most beautiful ship Italy had ever sent to sea, and she was conceived to be exactly that, a deliberate work of art and a statement of national resurrection. She entered service in 1953, less than a decade after the war had left Italy broken and humiliated, and she was built to announce to the world that Italy was whole again, proud again, and still capable of the craft and beauty that had always been her birthright. She was the flagship of the Italian line, and she was less a means of transport than a floating gallery, a manifesto in steel and art. They poured beauty into her at a level no liner had attempted. More than $4 million of her cost, an astonishing sum for the era, went into artwork alone. She carried murals, ceramics, mirrors, rare woods, mosaics, and sculpture commissioned from leading Italian artists. Each of her three classes given its own curated aesthetic, so that even a third-class passenger crossed the Atlantic surrounded by genuine art. In her first-class lounge stood a life-size bronze statue of the 16th century admiral whose name she bore, Andrea Doria, of Genoa. She had 3 outdoor swimming pools, one for each class. The first liner so equipped, she was elegant, modern, lovingly detailed, and unmistakably a thing made by people who believed that beauty was not a luxury, but a duty. She was the genuine article in the fullest sense, an object into which a recovering nation had poured its craft, its pride, and its faith into its own hands. And she was, in the way of beautiful things made by proud people, just slightly, too lightly governed in the one dimension that would kill her. There was a known issue with her stability, a tendency to ride high, and a little tender as her crossing wore on. It was a manageable issue, fully manageable, provided the people operating her did the unglamorous work of managing it. That is the hinge on which everything turns. The art was perfect. The managing was not. It is worth pausing on why a nation would pour $4 million of art into a ship, because to a purely practical mind that looks like waste, and it was the opposite of waste. It was the entire point. Italy in the early 50s had every reason for shame and exhaustion. It had backed the wrong side in a catastrophic war, been bombed and invaded and occupied, and emerged poor and humiliated. A poorer, more defeated country might have built a cheap, functional ship and called it sufficient. Italy built a masterpiece, on purpose, as an act of national will. A declaration sailed back and forth across the most watched ocean on earth, that the hands which had produced the Renaissance had not forgotten how. That beauty was still Italy's birthright, and Italy still meant to practice it. The Andrea Doria was propaganda in the most honorable sense, proof of life, She said to every passenger of every class who crossed in her that a broken nation had chosen to answer its brokenness with beauty rather than with mere utility. That is why she was a work of art and not just a ship, and is why her loss is not just the loss of a vessel, but the loss of a statement, a nation's wager that the genuine article was worth the cost, sent to the bottom because the people running the wager would not spend the small change required to keep her upright. The grandest possible gesture undone by the pettiest possible economy. To understand how a work of art ended up on the floor of the Atlantic, you have to understand two cut corners. Neither of them dramatic, both of them ordinary, both of them the kind of small economy that looks like nothing until the night it looks like everything. The Andrea Doria was running fast that night, and she was running fast in dense fog, because she was running late, and that is never an acceptable condition for the flagship of the Italian line. Transatlantic liners competed on schedule. Arriving on time in New York was a commercial necessity, a matter of pride in bookings and reputation. So as she approached the Nantucket lightship and heavy fog on the last night of her crossing, she did not slow to a crawl as the oldest rules of the sea would counsel. She pressed on at nearly full speed, running at flank, trusting her radar to see what her lookouts could not. This is the first counter, or excuse me, the first corner. Caution traded for the timetable. Speed in conditions that demanded slowness, because slowness costs money and reputation, and the radar made it feel safe enough. It was not a reckless act by reckless men. It was the routine, accepted, normalized shaving of a safety margin in the service of an economic pressure, which is precisely what makes it instructive, because that is how nearly all real disasters are actually built, not by villainy, but by the steady erosions of margins that everyone has agreed to stop noticing. The second corner is the one that turned a survivable accident into a catastrophe, and is the heart of the matter. By the final night of a westbound crossing, the Andrea Doria had burned through most of the fuel oil in her tanks. Empty fuel tanks were a stability problem. Full tanks sit low and keep a ship steady, but empty ones remove that low weight and let the vessel ride higher and roll more freely, and worse, a partly empty tank lets its remaining liquid slosh, a destabilizing effect mariners call the free surface. The seaman-like solution is old, simple, and well known. As you burn the fuel, you ballast the emptied tanks with seawater, refilling them with the weight you have consumed, keeping the ship low and stable. Then before arrival, you pump the seawater out. The Doria, by most expert reconstructions, was not adequately doing this. Refilling tanks with seawater and pumping them out again costs time, costs fuel to run the pumps, and leaves residue that complicates the next fueling. Small economies, small conveniences, a small cut corner repeated voyage after voyage with no consequence at all, until the consequence. Because she was riding high on near empty, unballasted tanks, she had far less stability in reserve than her design assumed. And so when the blow came, the ship that should have taken it and stayed upright instead began to roll over, and could not stop. The corner that had been cut 100 times without accident was waiting patiently for the one night it would collect everything it was owed. A work of art, undone not by the sea, and not even really by the collision, but by the quiet, accumulated decision that the tedious work of keeping her stable was not quite worth the trouble. The art was priceless. The ballasting, however, was free. They skipped the free part, and it cost them the priceless one. Coming the other way through the same fog that night was the Stockholm, a smaller Swedish-American liner of only about 12,000 tons, smallest passenger ship then working the North Atlantic, outbound from New York towards Gothenburg. But the Stockholm carried something the Doria did not, a bow reinforced for ice, a heavy hardened prow built to push through the northern fields. She was a smaller ship with a fist of iron at the front of her. What happened between the two ships in the fog was a tragedy of misread radar and converging courses. Each ship aware of the other, each maneuvering on a fatally mistaken picture of where the other was heading, each turn making the geometry worse instead of better. And then at about 10 after 11 that night, The Stockholm's ice-hardened bow drove squarely into the starboard flank of the Andrea Doria, penetrating nearly 40 feet into the beautiful ship, deep into the cabins and the very fuel tank spaces along her starboard side. The blow killed dozens instantly in the impact zone on both ships, 40 some on the Doria, 5 crewmen in the crushed bow of the Stockholm. It was a horror, but it was, in cold naval terms, a survivable horror. A ship with her stability reserved intact could have taken a wound like that, flooded the breached compartments, listed, and held long enough, upright enough, to be a stable platform from which every soul aboard could be taken off in good order. The Doria was not that ship that night, because of the empty tanks. Seawater poured into her breached starboard side, and there was no countering weight to balance it. And almost immediately she heaved over into a severe list to starboard, past 18 degrees, past 20, past the angle at which her watertight subdivision was certified to function, past the angle at which half her lifeboats, the entire portside bank, could be even launched at all. In a single lurch, the cut corner had taken away half her lifeboats and most of her time. The Art was now a sinking ship with seats for only half her people. And here the story turns, hard, from indictment to something close to glory. Because what human beings did in the next 11 hours in the precise opposite of the cut corner, and it deserves to be told with the same weight as the failure. The Andrea Doria had lifeboats for perhaps half the roughly 1,700 souls aboard. By every grim precedent, this should have been the Titanic again, with hundreds going down with the ship. It was not. Almost everyone lived, and the reason almost everyone lived, against the systemic failure that doomed the ship, individual people threw themselves into a rescue of staggering, improvised heroism. The call went out, and the ships answered from across the night sea. Freighters, a destroyer escort, a tanker, the little Cape Ann, the military transport Private William H. Thomas, the wounded Stockholm herself, which, despite her crushed bow, stayed and took on more than 500. But the act that turned the night was the return of the Ile-de-France. The great French liner had already passed, was already hours away on her own eastbound crossing, when she received the distress call, and her captain turned that enormous ship around in the dark and drove her back through the fog to the scene. He brought her in close, and then he did something unforgettable. He ordered every light on that ship blazed on, every single one of them, lighting up the great hull like a cathedral in the black fog, partly to see and partly, deliberately, to be seen, so that the terrified people clinging to the listing decks of a dying ship would look across the water and behold, suddenly, a blaze of light and safety, and the promise that they were not going to be left to drown. The Ile-de-France became a lighthouse with engines. Her boats ran back and forth through the swells all night. And on the dying ship herself, the heroism was hand to hand. With the list making it impossible to walk upright across the decks, crew and passengers formed human chains to pass people along the canted floors toward the boats. Crewmen worked the few launchable boats past exhaustion. Roughly 1,660 people were taken off that ship and lived, plucked from a vessel that had seats for half of them, by a fleet of strangers who came in the dark, and by a crew and passengers who refused to let the arithmetic of the lifeboats become the arithmetic of the dead. The systems had cut the corners that doomed the ship. The people refused to accept the death the corners had assigned. That tension, the failure of the system, and the heroism of the individuals inside it is the truest thing in the whole story, and it is a tension I recognize everywhere I look. The institution skimps. The human, at the moment of truth, doesn't. The rescue of the Andrea Doria is one of the great proofs that the second thing is as real as the first. Before the individual stories, understand the terrain, because the rescue numbers do not mean anything until you grasp what each of those 1,660 people had to physically do. A 40-degree list is not a tilt. It is the floor become nearly a wall. Every corridor turns into a chute. The staircases become an overhang on one side and a near vertical ladder on the other. Everything not bolted down, luggage, furniture, glass, people, slides to the low side and piles up there. The doors on the downhill side slam like traps, and the ones uphill weigh what a car weighs because opening them means lifting them against gravity. And over every surface runs a film of fuel oil and seawater leaking from the ship's own wounds, so that everything you reach for to steady yourself is slick. That is the terrain. People did not walk off the Andrea Doria. They climbed. Now subtract the light. Most of it gone. The middle of the night. Now subtract clear thought. Many had been asleep 10 minutes before, or concussed in the impact, or sedated, or simply did not speak the language the crew was shouting in. And remember, there was no immediate, clear order to abandon ship. So for a long stretch, people had to work out for themselves that the ship was dying. And then find the will to move through the canted, dark, oiled, slick labyrinth toward boats that might not be there. And they did it. Most of them did it. That is the thing worth stopping over, because it points at the one element in this entire story that could not be cut. Everything else was shaved: the speed, the ballast, the lifeboats, launchable only at half. Every system the ledger touched, it skimped. But the will to live does not run on a ledger. It runs precisely where the systems collapse, and it rises hardest at the worst moment. The ship betrayed the people. The people did not betray themselves. That uphill climb in the dark is the human animal refusing the death the situation had assigned it. And that refusal is the same fire, exactly as a maker reaching past the sufficient toward the sublime. The strive to build something great and the strive to stay alive are one flame pointed two directions. And the strangest proof of it is that the will lives underneath the thinking mind. The sailor, sedated in the infirmary that night, was not reasoning his way out. He was barely conscious. But something older and deeper than thought still hauled a body up a canted deck towards the light. Even when the mind goes foggy with shock or drugs or terror, the will keeps its grip on the railing. That is the part no tonnage figure and no accident report will ever hold. And that is the part that matters most. So let me tell it at human size, because 1700 is a number, and the genuine article is never a number. It always is, in the end, a particular person in a particular dark doing a particular impossible thing. The full story is that of Dr. Thur Peterson and his wife, Martha, and a steward named Giovanni Ravelli, and it is almost unbearable. Thur Peterson was a chiropractor from New York, asleep with his wife Martha in their first-class cabin on the starboard side, directly in the path of the Stockholm's bow. The collision obliterated their cabin. Peterson was thrown clear and knocked senseless. When he came to, in the wreckage and the dark, he found his wife Martha pinned, crushed beneath a collapsed steel structure, an elevator housing and debris fallen across her body, her back and her legs broken. She was alive. She was conscious. And she was trapped under wreckage in a ship that was rolling further onto her side with every passing minute, in the dark with the sea coming in. Peterson would not leave her. He found a steward, Giovanni Ravelli, and the two men, a passenger and a crewman, strangers to each other an hour before, worked together in that wrecked, tilting, darkened space for hours, trying to free Martha. Ravelli found a jack somewhere in the chaos, and they used it to try to lift the steel off her body, pumping, straining, the whole ruined cabin canted at a sickening angle around them, the ship groaning towards capsize. They got morphine into her and into another trapped, injured woman nearby. They lifted the wreckage by inches, and it was not enough. Martha Peterson's injuries were too great, and she died there in the dark before they could free her. Her last words, by the account that survives, a quiet apology to her husband. "Oh, darling, I think I'm going." Only then, only when she was gone, did the two men finally save themselves and the other woman and climb out of the wreckage toward the boats. I keep that story close because it holds the whole thing in miniature. A man and a stranger, in the dark, in a dying work of art that a cut corner had doomed, refusing for hours to accept the death the situation had assigned, and losing anyway, and going on. That is what the systemic failure actually costs, measured correctly, not a statistic, but Martha Peterson under the steel and the two men who could not lift it in time. The cut corner is an abstraction. Its price is always paid in that cabin, in that dark, by those particular hands. Whenever I am tempted to discuss mismanagement as a matter of policy and economics, I make myself remember the jack and the inches and the apology. That is the real denomination the ledger pays out in. And then, at the very opposite of the pole that same night, there's the strangest human story of all. A man who experienced the entire catastrophe as a kind of absence, and who became, against all odds, its final survivor. His name was Robert Lee Hudson, and he was not really a passenger at all in the ordinary sense. He was an American merchant seaman who had injured himself working aboard another ship, the Ocean Victory, and was being repatriated home from Naples. He was riding in the Doria's infirmary, a hurt sailor catching a berth in the ship's hospital, and on that night of the collision, he had been given sleeping pills, and he was deeply, chemically asleep in an infirmary bed when the Stockholm's bow tore into the ship. He slept through it, through the impact, through the SOS, through the alarm and the panic, through hours of evacuation, through the human chains and the lowering boats and the blaze of the Ile-de-France. All of it happened to the ship around him while he lay sedated and oblivious in the hospital. He did not wake until the vessel had already heeled over to something like a 40-degree list, the world gone sideways and groaning around his bed. He came up out of a drugged sleep into a nightmare that was already nearly over, onto a ship that was already mostly empty, already dying, already most of the way to the bottom. Imagine the horror of that surfacing. To close your eyes in an ordinary berth and open them alone into a brightly lit, canted, deserted ruin, with no idea that the catastrophe had come and gone while you dreamed. And here's the detail that turns the strange into the unforgettable. Robert Hudson was the last living person taken off that ship. The men who slept through the entire disaster walked out of it last, found in his pajamas by the crew of one of the final lifeboats, rowed away across the abandoned, brilliantly lit hull toward the bow. The very last soul to leave the dying ship alive, plucked from the water by a passing tanker. The sleeper became the closer. While Peterson worked the jack in the dark and the human chains passed the living across the decks, and the Ile-de-France blazed in the fog, one injured sailor lay dreaming through all of it, and then woke just in time to be the final human being the ship would ever carry. There is no moral to extract from that one. It is simply the kind of thing that is true, and that no one would dare invent. The man who missed the whole disaster was the last man it let go. I put all three of these beside each other on purpose. Peterson with the jack, the captain who would not leave, and the sailor who slept through the end of the world and woke to close it, because the human element is not a decoration on the history. It is the history. A ship is steel and art and tonnage until the night of it is dying. And then it is suddenly and only people. A man will not leave his wife, a captain who will not leave his ship, a sleeper who wakes alone into the wreck. That is what the loss actually is, underneath the specifications. Not a vessel. The particular human beings inside her on the worst night of their lives, each meeting it in their own irreducible way. And there is one more figure who has to be named because he carried the cost in a different currency. Captain Piero Calamai, the Andrea Doria's master. Whatever share of the night's failures belonged to him. The speed in the fog, the misread radar, he answered for it in the oldest way a captain can. As his ship died beneath him, he intended to go down with her. and he had to be argued off his own bridge. His officers, already in a lifeboat, refused to leave the side until he came, and only then did he abandon ship. He survived the night, but by many accounts he never recovered from it. A man who had commanded a work of art and watched her roll over, who carried the names of the dead for the rest of his life, reportedly haunted to his final days, said to have asked after the Andrea Doria as he himself lay dying years later. The cut corner does not only kill the people under the steel, it hollows out the people who were responsible for the thing, who loved it and lost it and had to live on. The ledger's price is paid in lives, and in the cabin in the dark, and also in the slow ruin of the ones who have to carry the loss afterwards. There is no cheap death for a genuine article. Someone always pays the full freight for the rest of their life. Now, there was a passenger on the Andrea Doria that night that no one was trying to save, because almost no one knew it was there, and it could not call for help. Deep in her cargo hold sat a single automobile, the Chrysler Norseman, a one-of-one concept car, and one of the most heartbreaking losses in the entire history of automobiles. The Norseman was a dream made metal. Chrysler had commissioned it as a rolling showpiece of the future, and to build it they sent the design to Carrozzeria Ghia in Turin to the Italian master craftsmen who still formed automobile bodies by hand. And those hands took 15 months and an estimated 50,000 hours of labor to make it. The aluminum body hammered by hand over wooden bucks, shaped panel by panel by men who were the living inheritors of a coach-building tradition centuries deep. Its signature was a radical cantilevered roof, pillarless at the front, the entire roof structure suspended without the usual posts framing the windshield. A feat of engineering audacity that made the cabin feel impossibly open. A piece of the future built by ancient hands. It was finished, singular, and astonishing, and it had never been seen by the public. It was being shipped to America for its grand unveiling, its debut on the show stage, its moment. It was riding in the hold of the Andrea Doria to get there. It never arrived, and it was never unveiled, and it was never seen. When the Doria capsized and sank, the Norseman went down sealed in her hold, into the dark and the salt, and there it has stayed ever since. When divers reached the wreck and found it decades later, the 50,000 hours of handwork had been reduced to rust mush, a barely recognizable mass of corrosion, identifiable by some accounts only by its tires. The most extreme loss imaginable. A genuine article so completely destroyed that even its destruction was private. A masterpiece that went from the craftsman's hands to the seafloor without the world's eyes ever once falling on it. The other things in this story at least got to be what they were before they were lost. The Norseman was denied even that. It is the foreclosed future in its purest form. 50,000 hours of human reaching, entombed before the reach could ever be witnessed, dissolving now into nothing at the bottom of the sea. The hand of the maker, erased before it could be seen. Now turn to the third ship, the one that did the striking, and the one whose fate carries the strangest and most pointed lesson of all. The Stockholm did not sink. She limped back to New York under her own power, her ice-hardened bow crushed and gone, 5 of her crew dead, the press already branding her La Nave della Morte, the ship of death. Her ruined bow was rebuilt at a cost of $1 million, and then this small, tough, scandal-haunted Swedish ship did the most remarkable thing of all. She refused to die. She just kept going and going and going. What followed is one of the most astonishing survival careers in maritime history. She sailed on for the Swedish-American line, and then in 1960 was sold to East Germany and became the Volker Freundschaft, carrying trade unionists and party members on holiday cruises for a quarter of a century. Retired by the Germans in 1985, She briefly became the Volca, then was laid up, then served as the Fridtjof, Fridtjof Nansen, a floating barracks for asylum seekers in Norway. By rights, her story should have ended a dozen times in there. Instead, in the 1990s, Italian interests bought her and towed her to of all places to Genoa, the Andrea Doria's own home port, where the press that had not forgotten her called her the ship of death all over again. And there she was stripped to her bare steel hull, found still sound, and completely rebuilt into a modern cruise ship. And then she sailed on for 3 more decades, under name after name after name. Italia, Prima, Valtour, or Valtour Prima, Caribe, Athena, Azores, and at the last, from 2016, Astoria. 10 names across her life. She was attacked by pirates as the Athena and drove them off. And by the end, she had earned an extraordinary distinction. Built in 1948, still carrying passengers across the sea into 2020, she was the oldest ocean-going passenger ship still in active service anywhere on Earth. 72 years. The ship of death had outlived every other liner of her generation. Outlived the Andrea Doria by 64 years. Outlived the entire age of ocean travel that had made her, and was still impossibly sailing. She was a fighter. She took the worst blow of her era, was blamed for one of the most famous tragedies of the century, and she simply would not stop. Her hull was sound to the very end. So how do you kill a ship that will not die? A ship that survived the collision that sank a flagship, survived being branded a ship of death, survived East Germany and abandonment and a barracks berth and a full gutting to bare steel, survived pirates, survived 70 years and 10 names, and the death of her entire era? The sea could not do it. History could not do it. Time itself could not quite do it. Her hull was still sound after all of it. She was killed by a dock bill. When the COVID pandemic shut down the cruise industry in 2020, her operator went bankrupt, and the old ship, now the Astoria, was laid up, first in England, then towed to Rotterdam, where she sat idle, accruing dockage fees she had no income to pay. She did not sink. She did not rust away. She sat at a pier, perfectly afloat, perfectly sound, and ran up a bill. And in the end, a Rotterdam court ordered her sold at auction, not to save her, but so that the proceeds of her sale could pay the dockage fees she owed for the privilege of sitting still. The fighter who survived everything the sea could throw at her was condemned at last by an unpaid invoice and a court order, and sent toward the breakers to settle her own parking ticket. Stop and feel the full weight of that, because it is the whole point of this document. The thing the sea spent 67 years failing to kill was killed by paperwork, by a ledger, by the same species of small, bloodless administrative cause that ran all the way through this story from the beginning. The cut corner, the skipped ballast, the economy, the bill. And if that pattern sounds familiar, it should, because I have written it before, around another sound hull, the SS United States, the fastest ocean liner ever built, structurally sound, undefeated, is going to the bottom of the Gulf as the downstream result of a rent dispute over pier fees. 2 great sound hulls, 2 survivors of everything the ocean had, both finally brought down by the identical mechanism, not the sea, but the dock bill, not the storm, but the invoice. It is not a coincidence. It is the rule. The sea is honest and takes only what physics demands. The ledger is the thing that kills what the sea would have spared. 3 ships, 1 foggy night, 3 deaths. And not one of them, when you trace it honestly to the root, was really a death by sea. The Andrea Doria, a work of art, was killed by a cut corner, a skipped ballasting that turned a survivable wound into capsizing. The Norseman, a singular masterpiece, was killed by being treated as cargo, entombed unseen and dissolved to rust, 50,000 hours of handwork that the world was never allowed to witness. And the Stockholm, the indestructible fighter, was killed by a court order over an unpaid dock bill, after the sea had tried and failed for the better part of a century. The ocean was present at all three deaths. The ocean caused none of them. What killed them was us. The ledger, the cut margin, the bill, the bean-counted decision that the unglamorous work of keeping a genuine thing alive was not quite worth the trouble. And yet the same night gives the answer to its own indictment, because braided through every one of those failures is the other thing, the human thing. The Ile-de-France turning around in the dark and lighting herself up like a cathedral. The human chains across the canted decks. Peterson and Ravelli with the jack, in the dark, refusing for hours to leave Martha under the steel. 1,660 people taken off a ship with seats for half of them. The systems cut the corners. The people, at the moment of truth, refuse the arithmetic. Both are true. Both are always true. The ledger writes the death warrant, and the human hand, again and again, tears it up where it can. So this is for the Andrea Doria, the most beautiful ship Italy ever made, lying on her side, 80-some years now, off Nantucket, killed by a corner no one wanted to bother cutting square. It is for the Chrysler Norseman in her hold, 50,000 hours of Italian hands gone to rust mush in the dark. The most beautiful thing almost no one ever saw. And it is for the Stockholm, the Astoria, the ship of 10 names and 7 decades, the fighter the sea could not kill, condemned at last by a dock bill, sound to the end. Remember which one was the villain. It was never the water. The art was priceless and the ballast was free. They skipped the free part, and it cost them the priceless one. The fighter survived everything the sea had for 67 years and was killed at last by an unpaid dock bill. The sea is honest. Remember which one was the villain. It was never the water.